Chapter 1. The Royal Chamber of Screams. The smell came first, not the acrid tang of torches burning along damp stone walls, not even the metallic bite of iron chains hanging from vaulted ceilings. No, it was the smell of fear itself, sweat, blood, the putrid stench of flesh that had been broken piece by piece under the watchful gaze of men who wore velvet and ermine. Deep beneath the grandeur of a palace where chandeliers glittered and courtiers danced, there existed another world, a hidden chamber where the screams of the accused were swallowed by thick walls, where torchlight flickered across instruments designed not to kill quickly, but to extract every last shred of agony before death mercifully arrived. This was no dungeon for common criminals. This was a royal chamber reserved for those who had displeased the crown, for those whose blood was noble, whose names were whispered in halls of power, whose downfall served a purpose far greater than justice. In the center of the room a man hung suspended by his wrists. His fine silk tunic, once embroidered with gold thread, now hung in tatters soaked through with sweat and crimson. His breathing came in shallow gasps. Around him 3 figures moved with methodical precision. Not soldiers, not executioners, these were specialists, men trained in the art of prolonging suffering, artists of agony employed by kings who understood that terror was the sharpest tool of governance. One stepped forward holding an iron device, still glowing faintly from the forge. The prisoner's eyes widened. He tried to speak, perhaps to plead, perhaps to curse, but his voice had been reduced to a ragged whisper hours ago. The iron-touched flesh, the scream that followed, was inhuman. Outside, in the palace above a banquet, continued laughter echoed through marble corridors. Musicians played, wine flowed freely. No one asked about the empty seat at the table. No one dared. This was the reality of royal power behind the gilded portraits and heroic legends, behind the divine right and sacred oaths. There existed a machinery of cruelty so refined, so deliberate, that even centuries later, the records still make us recoil. What you are about to hear is not folklore. These are not myths embellished by time. These are documented acts, sanctioned, ordered, and sometimes personally supervised by monarchs whose names you know, whose legacies have been sanitized by history. The torture chamber was not an aberration. It was policy, it was statecraft, it was a message written in broken bones, and shattered minds defy the crown, and this is your fate. In the flickering torchlight, as the prisoner's screams finally faded to silence, the men stepped back. Their work was done for now. Tomorrow there would be others. There were always others, because in the architecture of absolute power, fear was the foundation and pain was the architect's most reliable tool. But what drove kings and emperors to such horrors? The answer lies buried in bloodlines, faith and fear. Chapter 2. Bloodlines of Doom. To understand the cruelty, you must first understand the throne itself. It was never just a seat. It was a symbol forged in violence, passed down through generations, soaked in blood, defended by methods that would haunt the nightmares of those who witnessed them. And those who sat upon it, they were not merely rulers. They were in their own minds, and in the minds of their subjects, chosen by God, divine, untouchable, absolute. This belief, this doctrine of divine right, was perhaps the most dangerous idea ever to take root in human governance. It transformed mortal men into living gods, their whims into holy mandates, their paranoia into righteous fury. And when a man believes himself accountable only to heaven, earthly mercy becomes optional. The great dynasties of Europe, Asia, and the Middle East all understood this. The Tudors of England, the Romanovs of Russia, the Ming emperors of China, the Ottoman sultans, the Valois and Bourbon kings of France, each lineage carried with it not just a crown, but a legacy of violence, necessary to maintain it. Consider the house of Tudor Henry VIII, the king who broke from Rome and declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, did not do so out of theological conviction alone. He did it for an heir, for the continuation of his bloodline. And when those in his path, wives, advisors, friends, became obstacles, they were removed with a brutality that shocked even his contemporaries. Thomas More, once his trusted chancellor, beheaded, and Boleyn, the woman he'd torn his kingdom apart to marry, executed on fabricated charges of adultery. and treason Thomas Cromwell, the architect of his religious revolution, destroyed on the same scaffolding he'd built for others. But Henry was not unique. He was simply explicit about what other monarchs did in shadows. In Russia, Ivan the Terrible earned his epithet through deeds that still defy comprehension. Convinced that boyars, the noble class, were conspiring against him, he created the Obrukhnina, a state within a state, a private army of black-clad enforcers who answered only to him. They swept through regions suspected of disloyalty, massacring entire populations. In Novgorod alone, tens of thousands died. But it was Ivan's personal involvement in torture that marked him as something beyond cruel. He didn't merely order suffering. He participated. He watched, he refined techniques. He turned brutality into performance art. The psychology behind this is as chilling as the acts themselves. These were not sadists in the conventional sense. It was strategic. Torture served multiple purposes. It extracted confessions, real or fabricated, that could be used to justify eliminations. It demonstrated power to those who remained. It created a climate of terror so pervasive that rebellion became unthinkable. And religion, rather than tempering this cruelty, often sanctified it. The Spanish Inquisition, authorized by Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella, wielded torture as a tool of faith. The Strapado water torture. These were not acts of barbarism. They were holy work, designed to save souls by breaking bodies. The logic was perverse, but internally consistent. Physical pain was temporary, but heresy damned one to eternal suffering. Better to torture a confession and save a soul than to let it perish in error. In the Ottoman Empire, fratricide became official policy. When a new sultan ascended the throne, it was customary, even legally sanctioned, for him to order the execution of his brothers. All of them. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was pragmatism. Dead brothers could not lead rebellions. The practice codified in law declared for the welfare of the state. The death of princes is permissible even in China, where Confucian philosophy emphasized harmony and order. Emperors wielded torture with calculated precision. The Lingchi death by 1,000 cuts was reserved for the worst traitors. The victim would be methodically sliced piece by piece, kept conscious through careful technique, their suffering prolonged over hours or even days. It was spectacle. It was deterrent. It was the ultimate expression of imperial displeasure. What united these distant kingdoms and disparate cultures was a shared understanding. The throne was not held by love alone. It was held by fear. And fear required demonstration. It required witnesses. It required examples so horrifying that even the thought of defiance would curdle in the mind before it could become action. Yet even within these gilded halls, whispers of betrayal festered, plots that would doom even the most untouchable. Chapter 3: Whispers and Shadows. Power by its nature breeds paranoia. The closer one stands to the throne, the more enemies multiply. In the shadows, a trusted advisor becomes a potential usurper. A beloved sibling transforms into a rival. Even the heir, the very future of the dynasty, can become a threat if ambition blooms too early or loyalty wavers at the wrong moment. In the courts of absolute monarchs, survival required more than competence. It demanded perfect calibration of loyalty. The ability to read the subtlest shifts in royal mood, the instinct to know when silence was safer than speech. One misstep, a poorly timed suggestion, an association with the wrong faction, a rumor planted by a rival, could mean the difference between continued favor and a midnight arrest. And so the courts became theaters of perpetual intrigue. Behind every bow and honeyed word lay calculation. Factions formed and dissolved. Alliances shifted like sand, and hovering over it all was the monarch, watching, weighing, wondering who among the smiling faces harbored treachery. Take the court of Louis XIV, the Sun King, who centralized French power at Versailles and transformed his nobles into gilded captives. He kept them too close to plot effectively, but close enough to watch. He created a system where status was measured in proximity to his person, where a glance or a word from the king could elevate a family or ruin it. But even Louis, despite his control, lived in perpetual vigilance. His own mother, Anne of Austria, had once conspired against Cardinal Richelieu. His brother, Philip, Duke of Orleans, was kept deliberately weakened, his military talents wasted in frivolous pursuits, lest he become too powerful. The paranoia was not irrational. History provided ample evidence that trust was a monarch's most dangerous indulgence. In England, Edward IV had trusted his brother George, Duke of Clarence. They were blood. They had fought together in the Wars of the Roses. The George grew resentful, ambitious, treacherous. He plotted. He conspired with enemies, and when his betrayal became undeniable, Edward faced an impossible choice: punish a brother or risk the stability of the realm. George was arrested. The official story says he was drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine, executed privately, sparing the family public shame, but sending an unmistakable message: not even blood could protect the disloyal. In the Byzantine Empire, that millennial exercise in political survival, paranoia was practically encoded in the imperial DNA. Emperors blinded rivals to prevent them from claiming the throne, the belief being that physical imperfection disqualified one from rule. Sons blinded fathers, brothers blinded brothers. It became so common that a specific term emerged: ichthyosis, political blinding. It was considered merciful compared to execution, a humane alternative that preserved life while eliminating threat. But paranoia didn't always require proof. Sometimes mere suspicion was enough. Empress Wuxi of China, the only woman to rule the empire in her own right, rose to power through a combination of intelligence, ruthlessness, and an acute understanding of fear. She began as a concubine, maneuvered her way to become empress, and eventually took the throne itself. But she knew that her position, unprecedented and therefore precarious, required constant vigilance. She established a secret police network, encouraged denunciations, rewarded informants. Officials who arrived at court in the morning could find themselves in torture chambers by evening, accused of crimes they hadn't committed by rivals they hadn't recognized. Was she cruel? Undoubtedly. Was she unusual? Not in the slightest. She simply perfected systems that other rulers had employed less efficiently. The most insidious aspect of court paranoia was how it corrupted those around the throne. Courtiers became informants, friends betrayed friends to prove loyalty, families turned on their own members to distance themselves from suspicion. The torture chamber became not just a place of punishment, but a tool of political navigation. A threat that hung over every interaction, every private conversation, every unguarded moment. And the monarchs themselves, they were often trapped. As much as their subjects to show weakness was to invite challenge, to show mercy was to appear soft, to trust was to risk betrayal. And so they ruled from within prisons of their own making, surrounded by people they could never fully trust, wielding power that required them to commit acts that corroded their own humanity. In the court of Philip II of Spain, the king who commanded an empire where the sun never set, paranoia reached almost pathological levels. He trusted no one. He read every document personally, micromanaging governance from his desk at El Escorial. He suspected everyone, ministers, generals, even his own son Don Carlos. When Carlos began showing signs of mental instability and political unreliability, Philip faced the terrible calculus of kingship, the safety of the realm versus the love of a father. Carlos was arrested, imprisoned, and died under mysterious circumstances that Philip never fully explained. The whispers in court grew deafening. Had Philip ordered his own son's death? The king never confirmed it, never denied it. The ambiguity itself became a tool of terror. If a son could disappear for suspected disloyalty, what protection did anyone else have? And when suspicion turned to accusation, the next step was inevitable. The chamber of pain awaited. Chapter 4. The breaking point. The descent into the torture chamber was both physical and psychological. Stone steps worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, most going down, far fewer coming back up. The temperature dropped with each step, the air growing thick with moisture and something else, something that clung to the throat and made breathing difficult even before the pain began. This was the machinery of confession, the architecture of breaking the human will. And the instruments that filled these chambers were not crude tools of barbarity. They were refined, engineered, perfected over generations to produce maximum suffering while preserving life long enough to extract whatever the crown required: names of co-conspirators, admissions of guilt, renunciations of faith, public confessions that would justify predetermined punishments. Let us speak plainly about what occurred in these spaces. The rack was perhaps the most infamous. The prisoner was laid flat on a wooden frame, wrists and ankles bound to rollers at opposite ends. Then slowly, with deliberate measured turns, the rollers were cranked apart. The body stretched. First the joints creaked, then they popped. Shoulders dislocated, hips tore from their sockets, the spine elongated until vertebrae separated. The pain was so intense that many lost consciousness, but the operators were skilled. They knew how to keep victims aware, how to time the intervals between turns to maximize both agony and lucidity. In the Tower of London, the rack was a permanent fixture, and askew a Protestant reformer. During the reign of Mary, I was racked so severely that she could not stand for her own execution. She had to be carried to the stake in a chair. Her crime: refusing to recant her faith, her suffering a message to others who might harbor similar convictions. The rack was merely one instrument in an extensive catalogue of torment. The strappado required less equipment, but produced comparable results. The victim's hands were tied behind their back, attached to a rope threaded through a pulley in the ceiling. They were hoisted suddenly, their entire body weight suspended by their arms, shoulders dislocated instantly. Then, while hanging, weights were added to their feet, stones or iron plates, increasing the downward pull, intensifying the tearing sensation in every joint. Some operators would drop the victim partway, then jerk the rope toward the sudden stop. With shattered bones, Galileo, yes, the scientist whose discoveries reshaped our understanding of the cosmos, was threatened with the strappado during his Inquisition trial. A mere threat, the sight of the instrument, was enough to extract his recantation. He was 70 years old and understood perfectly what awaited him. If he refused, he chose survival over truth, at least publicly. The Iron Maiden, despite later historians debating its prevalence, appeared in various forms across European dungeons. It was a sarcophagus lined with spikes not long enough to pierce vital organs immediately, but positioned to penetrate flesh at dozens of points simultaneously. The victim was sealed inside. The door closed slowly. The spikes entered the body gradually through arms, legs, torso, face. Death came slowly from blood loss and shock, and the screams from within the sealed chamber were muffled enough not to disturb the court above. But physical instruments were only half the arsenal. Psychological torture, the breaking of the mind, was often more effective than breaking the body. Sleep deprivation was a favorite technique of the Inquisition. The accused would be kept in a cell lit continuously day and night, with guards ensuring they could not rest. After days of sleeplessness, hallucinations began. The mind fractured, perception blurred, and in this state of mental collapse, confessions flowed freely, though whether they bore any relationship to truth was irrelevant. A confession obtained under torture, even one later recanted, could still be used in trial. The legal systems of the time specifically allowed it. In the dungeons beneath Edinburgh Castle, suspected witches, mostly women accused by neighbours or rivals, were subjected to waking the witch. They were kept awake for days, sometimes a week or more, until their minds broke completely. Then, in their delirium, they would confess to flying on broomsticks, consorting with demons, cursing crops, and these confessions, produced by shattered minds and exhausted bodies, and thousands to the flames. Water torture appeared in various forms. In one version, the victim was strapped to an inclined board, head lowered, then feet. A cloth was placed over the face, and water was poured slowly over it. The sensation was drowning, suffocation. Though no water entered the lungs, the panic was absolute. The body thrashed against restraints. The mind screamed for air. And when the cloth was removed, when breath returned, the questions began again, refused to answer, and the process repeated. The Spanish Inquisition employed this technique extensively. It was called toga. The practice of forced water ingestion. Records from trials describe victims' bellies swelling grotesquely as gallon after gallon was poured into them through funnels forced into their mouths. The pain was excruciating, the humiliation profound, and the confessions that followed were considered legally valid, used to condemn heretics to burning at the stake. But perhaps the most horrifying aspect of royal torture was its calculated nature. These were not acts of passion, they were policy. Each session was recorded by scribes, each cry documented, each admission transcribed for later use in trial. The law required it, the church sanctioned it, and the monarchs who ordered it slept soundly in their royal beds, convinced that the suffering below served the greater good of realm and faith. In the dungeons of the Doge's palace in Venice, suspects were held in cells called pozzi. The wells, tiny spaces at sea level where water seeped through walls, and prisoners stood in filth, unable to sit or lie down above them. In the piombi, the leads, other prisoners roasted under tin roofs in summer heat. The choice of cell was not random, it was calibrated to the suspect's status and the urgency of extracting confession. Nobles got the piombi, common criminals got the pozzi. Each was designed to break a different type of person. Giacomo Casanova, the famous lover and adventurer, was imprisoned in the piombi. His memoirs describe the crushing psychological weight of captivity, the heat, the isolation, the knowledge that he could vanish entirely, and no one outside would ever know his fate. He eventually escaped, one of the few ever to do so, but his account provides rare testimony of what these spaces were designed to produce: absolute despair. And then there were the tortures designed not to extract confession, but to punish, to serve as warning, to demonstrate the price of defying the crown. Flaying involved the removal of skin while the victim remained alive. It was slow work requiring skill to keep the subject conscious throughout. Valverde's anatomical illustrations created for medical study ironically provided guides for torturers seeking to understand how much skin could be removed without immediately killing the victim. The Ottoman Empire employed flaying for particularly egregious betrayals. The skin would sometimes be stuffed with straw and displayed publicly, a grotesque trophy and warning. Combined impalement perfected by Vlad III of Wallachia. Vlad the Impaler. The inspiration for Dracula was death, a spectacle. A wooden stake carefully shaped and oil to avoid splintering was inserted through the body and erected vertically. If done skillfully, the stake avoided vital organs, allowing the victim to survive for hours or even days. Displayed along roadsides as warnings to invaders, Vlad created entire forests of the impaled. Tens of thousands died this way, and while the world remembers him as a monster, his own people remember him as a defender who used terror as a weapon against overwhelming odds. By the time the screams echoed through the palace, even the loyal trembled, and one misstep could mean death. Chapter 5: Public Spectacle of Death. But some fates were too significant to unfold in the privacy of dungeons. Some deaths demanded witnesses, some punishments required an audience. Because the true purpose of royal torture and execution was not simply to eliminate enemies, it was to inscribe the power of the crown into the collective memory of the people. Public executions were theater, carefully choreographed performances designed to communicate specific messages about authority, justice, and the consequences of defiance. The scaffold was not merely a structure for killing, it was a stage, and every element of the execution was considered: the location, the method, the order of events. Even the words spoken by the condemned in London, Tower Hill, and Tyburn were synonymous with death. Thousands gathered to watch. Nobility and commoners alike meet their ends. Vendors sold food and drink. Children perched on their fathers' shoulders for better views. The atmosphere was part festival, part sermon, part cautionary tale. When Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, was led to the scaffold on May 19, 1536, the execution was meticulously planned. Henry VIII, unwilling to use the traditional axe, or perhaps offering a final twisted mercy, imported a swordsman from Calais and dressed carefully that morning, choosing a grey damask gown and ermine mantle, her hair tucked beneath a coif. She walked to the scaffold with composure that unsettled witnesses. Before kneeling, she addressed the crowd, carefully avoiding any words that might be construed as criticism of the king who had ordered her death. "Good Christian people," she said, "I am come hither to die according to law, and therefore I will speak nothing against it." She knelt, a blindfold was tied. The swordsman approached silently, his blade concealed in the straw, and continued praying to Jesus Christ, "I commend my soul, Lord Jesus, receive my soul." The sword fell one clean stroke. Her lips were said to still be moving after her head was severed from her body. The crowd dispersed in silence. The message was delivered: even the queen could be erased if she displeased the king. But English executions, for all their ceremony, were almost merciful compared to what occurred elsewhere in France. The execution of Robert Frenois d'Armins in 1757 remains one of the most horrifying spectacles in recorded history. His crime, attempting to assassinate Louis Xu with a penknife, a blow that barely broke the skin. But attempted regicide demanded the ultimate punishment, death by dismemberment. On March 28, 1757, D'Armins was brought to the Place de Giarvie in Paris. The execution was to follow a precise ritual outlined in law, a ritual designed to produce maximum suffering while demonstrating the awesome power of royal justice. First, the hand that had held the knife was burned with sulfur, then molten lead, boiling oil, burning resin, and wax mixed with sulfur were poured into wounds that had been cut into his flesh. Then came the main event. 4 horses were harnessed to his limbs, positioned to pull in opposite directions. The horses pulled, the crowd watched. But D'Armins' body would not tear apart. The executioners had underestimated human tendon strength. The horses strained for over an hour, while D'Armins remained conscious. Screaming finally, the executioners used knives to sever the sinews at his joints, allowing the horses to complete their work. He was alive when the first limb tore free. He remained alive as the second and third were ripped away. His torso, still breathing, was finally thrown onto a pyre while the crowd watched in stunned silence. The execution was so horrific that it sparked debate even in an age accustomed to brutality. Casanova, who witnessed it, wrote that the crowd, initially eager for spectacle, fell into appalled silence. As the hours dragged on, even hardened Parisians who had seen countless executions found this one excessive. But excess was the point. This was not punishment, it was a statement written in flesh and blood. This is what happens to those who touch the sacred person of the king. Across Europe, different kingdoms employed different spectacles, each calibrated to their specific cultures and the crimes being punished. Drawing and quartering, reserved for traitors. In England was death in stages. The condemned was dragged through streets on a hurdle, hanged until nearly dead, then cut down while still conscious. The genitals were cut off and burned before the victim's eyes. The abdomen was opened, intestines removed and burned. Only then was the body beheaded and quartered, the pieces distributed to different locations as warnings. It was agony stretched across maximum duration, designed to demonstrate that treason was not simply a crime against law, but a violation of sacred order. Guy Fawkes, caught in the act of attempting to blow up Parliament and kill King James, I faced this sentence. But when his turn came, he leapt from the gallows platform, breaking his own neck to deny the executioners their full measure of suffering. Even in death, he managed a final act of defiance. In the Middle East, the Ottoman Empire employed sawing for particularly heinous crimes. The victim was hung upside down, ensuring blood flow to the brain, maintained consciousness, and sawed in half from the groin downward. The position ensured the victim remained aware as the saw progressed through their body, sometimes staying conscious until the saw reached the chest cavity. In Russia, during the reign of Peter the Great, executions became personal affairs. Peter, convinced of plots against him, personally participated in tortures and executions of suspected conspirators. He wielded the outer whip tipped with metal himself. He operated torture devices. He attended every execution, watching closely, ensuring that the condemned suffered adequately. His message was clear: no one, no matter how close to the throne, was safe from his wrath. The execution of the Streltsy elite military units who had rebelled became a prolonged spectacle. Over 1,000 men were executed over months. Some were beheaded, others hanged, still others were broken on the wheel. Peter ordered their bodies left on display throughout winter, rotting reminders visible from every approach to Moscow. When foreign ambassadors objected to the gruesome decorations, Peter responded that they served an important purpose: education. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of public execution was the forced participation of loved ones in China. The practice of GZ extermination of 9 kinship relations meant that an individual's treason condemned their entire extended family, parents, children, siblings, aunts, uncles, cousins, all executed, often forced to watch each other die. The message transcended the individual. Defiance threatened not just yourself, but everyone connected to you. Even children were not spared. The logic was coldly practical. Leaving survivors created future avengers. Better to extinguish the entire bloodline, to erase not just the traitor, but any possibility of revenge. In 1402, when the younger emperor usurped the throne from his nephew, he ordered the execution of Fang Xiaoru, a Confucian scholar who refused to draft the proclamation justifying the usurpation. Fang's defiance enraged the emperor, who expanded the traditional 9 kinship degrees to 10, executing 873 people connected to Fang, including his students, creating a 10th degree of punishment. Fang was forced to watch as his entire family was killed before him. Then his limbs were cut off one by one. His tongue was cut out to stop his curses. Finally, he was sliced to death in the Lingqi death by 1,000 cuts, his body methodically carved apart over hours. The spectacle achieved its purpose for generations. The story of Fang Xiaoru's fate circulated as a warning: defying the emperor could doom not just you, but everyone you had ever loved. And when the crowds dispersed, the echoes of terror remained not just in stone and flesh, but in the memory of a kingdom. Chapter 6: Shadows over the Throne. But every act of brutality carries consequences, often unintended, always corrosive. The monarchs who employed torture and public execution as tools of governance believed they were securing their reign, cementing their authority, ensuring the continuation of their dynasties. And in the short term, they were often correct rebellions, but crushed conspiracies unraveled. Courtiers learned the boundaries of acceptable behavior, and peasants learned not to question the divine right of kings. But terror, as a governing principle, carries inherent instability. It can suppress opposition, but it cannot eliminate discontent. It can force obedience, but it cannot inspire loyalty. And over time, the very mechanisms designed to protect the throne can weaken it, undermining the foundations of power, even as they appear to strengthen them. Consider the case of Ivan the Terrible. His Oprichnina, his private terror state, did indeed eliminate potential rivals. Boyar families were destroyed, regional power centers were crushed. But in the process, Ivan hollowed out the administrative capacity of his own government. He killed competent administrators and replaced them with loyal thugs. He devastated economically productive regions. And perhaps most significantly, he murdered his own heir. In a fit of rage, in 1581, Ivan struck his son Ivan Ivanovich with his iron-pointed staff. The blow, combined with kicks delivered while the prince lay on the ground, caused injuries from which he died days later. The famous painting by Ilya Repin, Ivan the Terrible and his son Ivan, captures the moment of horrified realization, the father holding his dying son, both covered in blood. The absolute devastation of recognition that the very paranoia meant to preserve the dynasty had instead destroyed it. Ivan the Terrible spent his final years in agonizing guilt, alternating between violent rages and monastic repentance. He died in 1584, leaving the throne to his feeble-minded son Fyodor, who was utterly unprepared to rule. The Rurik dynasty, which had ruled Russia for over 700 years, ended with Fyodor's death in 1598, plunging the nation into the time of troubles, a period of chaos, civil war and foreign invasion that nearly destroyed the Russian state. The terror that Ivan thought would secure his legacy instead guaranteed its disintegration. Similarly, the French monarchy's reliance on spectacle and terror reached its apotheosis under Louis XIV, and his successors. The Sun King centralized power, reduced nobles to courtiers, and built Versailles as a monument to absolute authority. But the system he created, beautiful, efficient, terrifying, was also brittle. It required constant maintenance, constant vigilance, constant demonstrations of power. By the time Louis XVI inherited the throne in 1774, the machinery of absolute monarchy had become unsustainable. The costs of maintaining the court, the military, the administrative apparatus, combined with disastrous foreign wars and mounting debt, had created conditions for revolution. And when the revolution came, it came with a fury born of centuries of suppressed rage. The guillotine, that symbol of revolutionary terror, was in many ways the culmination of royal practices. The revolutionaries did not invent terror, they inherited it, systematized it, and turned it against the very monarchs who had perfected it. Louis XVI, who had signed execution orders as king, found himself on the scaffold, his own neck beneath the blade. Marie Antoinette followed the aristocracy that had once watched executions as entertainment, now provided the victims. The revolution consumed itself. Of course, Robespierre, architect of the terror, eventually went to the guillotine. He had sent so many others to, but the cycle of violence he unleashed had roots in the old regime's use of torture and public execution as governance tools. The revolutionaries learned their methods from the kings. In England, the Tudor and Stuart dynasties' use of torture and execution to enforce religious conformity created lasting schisms. Catholics tortured under Elizabeth, Protestants burned under Mary, dissenters of all types crushed under various monarchs. These policies did not create religious unity, they created generations of resentment, underground resistance, and eventually civil war. The English Civil War, which saw King Charles I beheaded in 1649, was in part a consequence of Stuart absolutism. Charles believed in divine right, refused to share power, and employed torture and arbitrary imprisonment against his opponents. When Parliament finally rebelled, the accumulated grievances of decades exploded into violence. Charles's execution was presented as justice. A king who had treated his subjects as disposable now faced the same fate. Even the restoration of the monarchy under Charles II could not undo the precedent. A king had been publicly executed, the divine right theory had been shattered, and while future monarchs still ruled, they did so with the knowledge that their power was conditional, that subjects could become executioners if pushed too far. The psychological toll on the monarchs themselves should not be underestimated. Many rulers who employed torture extensively became increasingly paranoid, unable to trust even their closest advisors. Philip II of Spain spent his final years isolated in the El Escorial, surrounded by relics and religious art, obsessively managing his empire from his desk, trusting no one. He died in 1598 after weeks of agony from infected gout, his body literally rotting while he still lived, a metaphor perhaps for the moral decay that absolute power had wrought. Peter the Great, despite his modernization of Russia, became increasingly erratic and violent in his later years. The torture and execution of his own son Alexei, accused of plotting against his father, haunted Peter until his death. He had secured his reforms but destroyed his family in the process. And Henry VIII, the king who broke England from Rome and executed two of his wives along with countless others, died bloated and diseased, his leg ulcers so infected that courtiers could smell him from rooms away. His paranoia had grown so extreme that even his final wife, Catherine Parr, nearly lost her head for expressing theological opinions that differed slightly from his. The dynasties themselves often did not survive the terror they employed. The Tudors ended with Elizabeth I childless and alone, the last of a line that had blazed briefly and burned out. The Valois of France ended in chaos. The Romanovs ended in revolution and execution. The Ming dynasty collapsed into rebellion. The Ottoman sultans dwindled into irrelevance. There is a pattern here written across centuries and cultures. The tools of terror employed to secure power often become the instruments of a dynasty's destruction. They create enemies, they eliminate competent administrators, they foster climates of fear that stifle innovation and loyalty, and they corrupt the rulers themselves, transforming cautious pragmatism into paranoid brutality. For the rulers, the throne aim at a cost; for the people, the scars lasted generations. Chapter 7, Lessons in Horror. So what are we to make of this litany of horrors? These are not comfortable stories. They resist simple moralizing. The people involved, both perpetrators and victims, were human beings operating within systems and beliefs that to them seemed necessary, even righteous. To dismiss them as simply evil or barbaric is to miss the point, to reassure ourselves that we are different, that such things could never happen again. But the lesson of history is precisely the opposite. These horrors were not aberrations. They were not the products of a few uniquely cruel individuals. They were systemic, sanctioned, legal, embedded in the very structures of governance, and supported by the dominant ideologies of their times: the divine right of kings, the absolute power of emperors, the authority of religious institutions to punish heresy. These were not fringe beliefs. They were the foundations of order, taught in churches, codified in law, accepted by the vast majority of people as natural and inevitable. And that is the truly disturbing insight. Normal people operating within normal institutions of their time committed extraordinary acts of cruelty, because those acts were presented as necessary, as righteous, as serving a greater good. The torturer in the royal chamber was not a monster born of darkness. He was a functionary trained in his craft, paid by the crown, operating within legal guidelines. The king who ordered torture did not see himself as cruel. He saw himself as fulfilling his sacred duty to maintain order, to protect his realm, to preserve the divine authority entrusted to him. This is not to excuse these acts, it is to understand them, and to recognize the mechanisms by which societies normalize violence against those deemed threatening, heretical, or inconvenient. The uncomfortable truth is that many of the legal structures that enabled royal torture persisted well into the modern era. Torture remained legal in much of Europe until the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The last execution for witchcraft in Europe occurred in Switzerland in 1782, the same year that Mozart was composing operas. The Spanish Inquisition officially continued until 1830, for public executions remained common entertainment into the 20th century. The transition away from these practices was not inevitable. It required conscious effort, philosophical shifts, legal reforms, and cultural evolution. The Enlightenment's emphasis on reason and human rights, the development of new political philosophies that challenged absolute power, the gradual expansion of legal protections for the accused. These were hard-won achievements, not natural progressions. And even now, the impulses that drove royal torture persist: the belief that security justifies suffering, the conviction that certain people, terrorists, traitors, enemies, deserve exceptional treatment outside normal legal protections, the faith that inflicting pain can extract truth or deter others. Modern states may not employ the rack or the Iron Maiden, but enhanced interrogation techniques, rendition programs, black site prisons, and systematic torture all demonstrate that the underlying logic has not disappeared. It has simply been repackaged, justified with different language, but rooted in the same fundamental assumption that the state, when threatened, has the right to inflict suffering in the name of security. The forms change, the justifications evolve, but the core remains: power, when unchecked, will always find reasons to employ cruelty against those it perceives as threats. So what lessons can we extract from these dark histories? First, that power requires constraints. The monarchs who employ torture most extensively were those with the fewest limitations on their authority. Absolute power, as Lord Acton famously observed, corrupts absolutely. The antidote is not different leaders, it is systems that prevent any leader from accumulating absolute power. Second, that legal protections for the accused are not merely procedural niceties, they are bulwarks against state cruelty: the right to remain silent, protection against self-incrimination, the inadmissibility of confessions obtained through torture. These were not abstract principles developed by philosophers in ivory towers. They were responses to the specific horrors of royal torture chambers. Every legal protection we now take for granted was written in the blood of those who suffered its absence. Third, that transparency matters. Royal torture flourished in dungeons, in hidden chambers, in spaces where witnesses were controlled and records could be falsified. Modern human rights advocacy rests substantially on exposure, on bringing hidden cruelties into public view, on documenting abuses, on creating accountability through visibility. Fourth, that cruelty justified by necessity tends to expand. The torture techniques developed for political traitors migrated to religious heretics, then to common criminals, then to anyone the state deemed threatening. Once normalized in one context, cruelty spreads. The boundaries of the acceptable continuously shift unless actively resisted. And finally, perhaps most importantly, that the people involved in these systems, the torturers, the judges, the courtiers who watched the populations who accepted, were not fundamentally different from us. They were not uniquely evil or uniquely barbaric. They were humans operating within systems that normalized cruelty within belief structures, that justified it within institutions, that rewarded participation and punished dissent, which means that under the right conditions, or more accurately the wrong conditions, similar systems could emerge again. The mechanisms are understood, the justifications are endlessly adaptable. The human capacity for cruelty, especially when sanctioned by authority and justified by ideology, remains undiminished. The torture chambers of royal courts may be tourist attractions now, their instruments displayed behind glass, their histories sanitized for public consumption. But the impulses that filled them, the desire for control, the fear of threats, the conviction that security justifies suffering, these have not been consigned to history. They wait quietly in every unaccountable power structure, in every detention center where oversight is absent, in every legal framework that creates exceptions for certain categories of people, in every argument that security requires the suspension of rights. The monarchs who built those chambers believed they were securing their dynasties. They failed. The dynasties crumbled, the thrones were dismantled, the divine right of kings was exposed as a fiction, but the capacity for institutional cruelty survived. It adapted, it found new forms, new justifications, new victims, and as we lock the gates of the past, one question lingers: what horrors still wait quietly behind the masks of power? The answer, uncomfortable as it may be, is that they wait wherever power goes unchecked, wherever fear overrides principle, wherever security is valued more than humanity. They wait in policies written in bureaucratic language, in legal opinions that carve out exceptions, in cultural climates that dehumanize the accused. The torture chambers may be empty now, their iron devices rusted and broken, but the darkness that filled them has not disappeared. It has only learned to hide better.